Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. You're watching In Deep on the Delta, and today I'm going to be talking about what I call an observational strategy. And I use this strategy year-round, but primarily from the transition months, like from fall to winter and maybe into early winter to late winter. And this is a technique that I use primarily on big flooded islands or flats. So anywhere from Mildred to Frank's Track, or maybe a little area that you know that there's a flat that may only be the size of the lot that your house is on. But we're going to be looking and trying to find the specific areas within those large expanses of underwater vegetation. We're looking for the prime spots, and this is how I go about looking for them, how I go about fishing them, and how I go about finding them. Let's check out this technique. All right, the first thing we'll talk about is the bait rundown, and I really don't think the baits are all that important, but I do believe you want to keep just a limited number of rods on deck. I'll talk about 4 rods today, and those baits that are on those rods, you're going to want to make sure they're very different from one another. Now, the 4 baits that I will use in the fall to winter transition are going to be a jerk bait, and this will be a suspending jerk bait that will cover from about maybe 2 to 4 or 5 feet of water. When I want to get a little deeper, I'll usually have a chatterbait on, and that'll get me down from that 4 to maybe 6 or 8 or 10 feet of water. I found that this color of chatterbait, the fire craw, really works well on stripers. So chatterbait will be another bait that I keep on. And now, if you're not a big chatterbait guy, you can throw on an underspin, a Kitech, or maybe even a crankbait that will get down to that maybe 5, 6, 7 feet of depth. I will also, this time of year, throw a bigger bait. Today I've got a River to Sea S-Waver on in the 168 size. This is the light trout. This is also a very good bait for stripers, and it's a very good bait this time of year for largemouth bass. Now, my final rod that I have is basically a worm. I've got a billow stick on here, but a 5 or 6 inch Cinco is a bait that works really well out here. So let's talk about this strategy or this technique. I'm going to come out to, let's just say we're out at Mildred Island, and we have, it's a large expanse of water out here. And again, you have to put this into perspective with where you're fishing. Could be Frank's Track, which has even more water, or it could be that little honey hole that you have that is only, like the size of the lot that your house is on. But you know where these are, you've got them in your GPS, and you're going to come out and you're going to fish these, the flooded island, or the vegetation, the submerged vegetation. So the place that most of the fish are going to hold in these islands are the transition zones, that if you can find where it may be 2 or 3 feet of depth and it drops down to 4 to 5 feet of depth, you may have 5 or 6 feet of depth, and it may drop down to 7 or 8 or 10 feet of depth. You want to find those transition zones. One of the things that I look for when I'm just motoring around on my TM looking for, or trolling motor, looking for these transitions, is what the weeds are. And the vegetation out here, generally in the shallower water, the vegetation is going to be a little browner, and it's going to have kind of that silt, and you may even have that witch's hair on it. That's not my primary place that I'm looking for, but when I find that, I just keep moving on the trolling motor until I can find one of those ledges that starts to drop down. Now, once I find that ledge, usually I also find that same type of elodea, the vegetation that we have, turns from a kind of a brownish color to a nice green growing color. That is the transition that I'm looking for. And what you have to be really aware of, and where you want to really focus in on your observation, is finding those areas. And sometimes it's very difficult to put those on a graph because they're constantly changing. Now, if you find an area there and you mark it on your graph and you fish it, that's great. What I will do a lot of times is I'll take a couple of marker buoys, and I'll come into that area, and I'll find that one little zone that's maybe, let's just say it's going from 3 feet down to 7 or 8 feet, and we have that nice ledge that we're fishing, and it could be offshore 50 or 100 yards depending on where you're fishing. But I will mark that with a couple of marker buoys. And what is important when you're fishing these areas is if you can keep your bait in the strike zone. So if you have a strike zone that is right along that edge, that transition where it drops off, and your boat is out here and you're throwing into the shallow water, pulling it over into the deep water, you're going to find that most of your bites are going to come right at that transition zone. The problem being, your bait is only in that transition zone for maybe 3 or 4 feet, maybe 5 feet, as you're throwing into the top of the shallow water down into the deeper water. So what I will try to do is, once I get my buoy set up, I'll parallel with my boat and I will make a long cast, and I will try to run right down that edge so that my bait is constantly in the strike zone. Now there's going to be fish up in the shallow water, there's going to be fish out in the deep water, but take my word for it, the lion's share of those fish are going to be on that drop off, that zone from maybe 2 to 5 feet, or if it's 3 or 4 feet deep, down to 7 or 8 feet deep. Wherever it drops off, that's where most of the fish are going to be. Now this is why I keep those 4 baits on. I may start off with the suspended jerk bait, trying to get the aggressive fish that are going to take in the maybe the first 2, 3, 4 feet of water. If that jerk bait doesn't work, I will go with a chatterbait or a underspin to get down and fish that 6, 7, 8 feet of water. But I'm always keeping that bait right on that drop off. I'm not throwing into the shallow water out to the deep water. I'm positioning my boat right where I have my buoys, and I know, because generally I'll take those buoys and I'll put them right on the shallow side. I know if I keep my boat on the outside of those buoys, I can work right down those buoys and keep my bait in that prime zone. One thing that I want to talk to you guys about, especially this time of year, is when you're throwing jerk baits. It's a great bait out here, but a lot of folks talk about, I'm getting too many small fish. What I am finding as I am fishing those prime zones, I'm getting fish following that bait on almost every cast when I'm in the zone. Now a lot of them are small fish, and this is where observation may come in to play big time. You're working that jerk bait, you're catching a lot of small fish. You should be trying to get that jerk bait in view as soon as you could see it. The first thing I want to do is make a long cast so that I get my bait away from the boat and I could work it down that ledge. But as it comes into focus, as soon as I see that bait, as soon as I see that little white spot, I focus in on that. A lot of times you're going to be surprised how many fish are following it. You're also going to be surprised as that bait gets closer to the boat and you're able to look down beyond the 2 or 3 small fish that are following. You'll see bigger fish down below. And what's happening out here, I think a lot of times, is the smaller fish are just much more aggressive, and you're catching all of the smaller fish, and you may have to catch 50 of those small fish before you get that bait in the right spot where the bigger one is close enough to it to grab it before the small ones do. So if you're seeing that, you're throwing a jerk bait, you're catching a lot of small fish, and you notice that, hey, you know what, I see a 2 or 3 or 4 pounder that's down 2 or 3 feet deeper, and they're just not getting a chance to take that jerk bait, that's when you want to start fishing the worm. And I usually use a weightless wacky. But remember, we've already observed the area that we're in. We have our buoys out. We know right where that drop-off zone is. Now, instead of just taking a worm and throwing it, fan casting it in a 360-degree circle, we can position our boat and work that drop-off. And what I have found, that once I'm on that drop-off and I could throw the worm out and let it get to the bottom and just touch it a couple times, that's when I start getting a lot of the bigger fish. Now when you're using the worm, it's a weightless wacky style, whatever worm you're using. I'll throw it out, and if it's 8 feet deep and I know that it takes 6 seconds for it to fall to the bottom, it's going to be about a 12-second cast. I throw it out, I let it flutter down about halfway, I'll touch the rod just so the worm moves, see if I can trigger a strike. I'll let it drop all the way to the bottom, I'll let it set for 2 seconds, I'll touch it again, and then I'll reel up and I'll make that cast again. And that's how I cover these areas. And remember, there's fish all over out here, but boat positioning is extremely important, and you have to know where these ledges are, before you position your boat. So that's the way that I kind of go about finding some of these ledges out here. Now you can mark them on your graph when you come out for the next day, or let's say a week or two later. The vegetation may have changed and you may have to relocate and really dial in where that ledge is. It may move, 4 or 5 feet one way or the other. It just depends on how often you're out here and the time of year. So you're always fine-tuning these areas, and that's where the observation comes in. You have to make sure that you are watching what's going on all the time out here. One other thing I'd just like to say, when you're out here and you're having a tough day and you're moving around, you're trying to find these ledges, make sure that you are not just fishing for the next 10 minutes, you're fishing for the next month or the next 2 months. If you find one of those ledges, or maybe you see some fish, you want to mark it. Maybe not so much for what you're going to catch in the next 10 minutes, but maybe the next week when you come out, you know that that ledge is there. So at that point, you can come in and maybe you have some landmarks on the shore or something where you can come up and stay away from the ledge and hit it before the fish know that you're there. So always be watching, always be thinking a couple steps ahead, and try to put as many of these little techniques into your arsenal as you can fit. And you'll find that over the courses of the months and the years that you come out here and you've got all these little techniques that you're using to find ledges and fish them, you're going to start catching more and more fish. Thank you guys for watching. I know I tried to go over this really quick. It's much more in depth and there's a lot more detail than I've talked about, but that is the general philosophy of what I'm doing out here. So if you have any questions, just hit me up and I'll try to answer anything that I can. And until then, make sure you subscribe if you haven't subscribed, and I'll see you guys on the water. Thanks for watching.